Bonjour, and welcome on the Gospel Spice podcast, where you are invited to taste and see that the Lord is good. Gospel Spice is your Christ-centered podcast, infused with in-depth biblical flavors and sprinkled with a dash of French culture to spice up your relationship with God. Here is your host, Stéphanie Roussel.
We're continuing our series on rest, and so I'm just gonna leave you with it right away. Make sure you've caught the previous episodes. There's 4 episodes before this one on rest, and this is the one before last, and it's the first half of a keynote I gave at that same retreat, and the theme was delighting in God as the definition and the essence and the goal of rest. Enjoy. I talked a little bit last night about my upbringing in France. There's another thing that was very meaningful to me besides our little spring of water, was bread, French baguettes that I grew up on. I literally grew up on bread, basically. My grandma would pick us up after school. We had a bit of a dysfunctional family. My grandma kind of raised us a bit. And she would pick us up, and she knew my passion for fresh, hot baguette with just the right crust. And there was a bakery down the street that had just my favorite. So before she picked us up from school, she would grab a fresh one, and we would get to her house, and she would cut it open, and it would crisp just right. I can still hear it and like literally tasting it right now. And she would slather it with fresh bread. And then I love chocolate, as Roz mentioned, and she would take a chocolate bar, and the dark kind, like 80%, because that's my jam. And then she would grate some of it on the butter. And she used a cheese grater, you know, the kind like the vertical kind, so she would kind of do that. So there was a nice little mound of chocolate on my baguette. And she usually didn't want to scrape her fingers off, so there would always be a little bit of chocolate that she couldn't grate. She would always plant it at the end of my slice of baguette, and we would always call it the chocolate queen. That was in French, though. La Reine en chocolat. And I would always make my way through the baguette until I got to the chocolate piece. I don't really have a spiritual explanation for this. I just wanted to share that with you because we're friends at this point, right? My point, though, is that I always saved that little bit of chocolate last. My brother always started with it. We had very different strategies. I think he was concerned I would get to his before he could get to it. Fast forward a couple of decades, we're now living in North Africa with our kids, and they're the age that I was when my grandma did that for me. So guess what I did when I would pick them up from school? I would go to the local bakery that did not carry French baguettes, because this was Africa. They had the round flat breads that you can probably picture being very similar to what Jesus used. And I would slice them in half, put fresh butter, shave some chocolate, and put a little chocolate queen in the end. Well, it was a circle, so it's kind of hard to find the end of it, but we managed. They're fine. They're not too traumatized by the round bread. But now we've passed on that tradition. I'm not in a hurry for them to have kids of their own, but when they do, if they do, then I hope they carry that tradition. My point is that bread is important. And Jesus knew that. And his culture also was full of symbolism around bread and fellowship. And really the only reason why I'm telling you this story, because it's my way to invite you into the fellowship of the experience of that. Because bread is about fellowship. It's about spending time together, and not just bread, of course, food in general. And Jesus did that a lot. He brought his people in through illustration and through food a lot. So much so that he used illustrations with bread to talk about God, and we'll talk about that. There's a passage in Matthew 12, and I literally forgot my Bible. So much for the Bible teacher. Hey, there you go, right? But there's in Matthew 12, that's fine, I can probably summarize that for you. Matthew 12, the beginning of the chapter, Jesus' disciples are rebuked by a Pharisee for eating heads of grain on the Sabbath. They're walking through the fields. If you've seen The Chosen, awesome way of rendering it. And Jesus reminds them as they're picking the heads of grain and the Pharisees are mad at them. Jesus reminds them of the time when David's men ate the consecrated bread from the table inside the tabernacle. Well, it was the one that had been removed. So technically it wasn't on the table yet anymore. But they weren't guilty of sin for eating bread that had been consecrated. So, I mean, the relationship of humans with bread is old. We just love bread. And this says this girl who's done all the keto diets in the world. So much for bread. But Jesus at that moment says he is Lord of the Sabbath. We're talking about rest, so we can't not look at what he means by that. So my first question before we dig a bit more is, what heads of grain are we called to eat during our Sabbath rest? Fair question. And before we go to the ones we can eat, what about the ones we should avoid? Which ones are the weeds in that field of grain? My question is really, what is it that we delight in that is not healthy for us? And some would say bread. Not going to go there. But in body and mind and in heart, what are the addictions? How do we escape? What heads of grain do we eat that we know are not good for us? Last night, I talked a little bit about rest and what rest is not. And I want to hone in tonight on the fact that a lot of our restlessness that we experience maybe in our culture might have to do with a measure of discontent, a lack of contentment. I want to believe that somehow contentment and rest are kind of twins. It's extremely hard to be rested and restful when you're discontent, when you're fretting about something. On the other hand, when you're truly content, maybe after a good meal, it's easier to feel restful, even physically, and even more so spiritually. So I want to contend with you that restlessness is often rooted in discontent. And I'm afraid I'm really speaking from personal experience here. And maybe I hope I'm the only one. I hope I'm talking to an empty room and none of you has ever experienced discontent or restlessness. We are unable to rest. We experience unrest or restlessness because we're trying to be content with something that is discontenting us. Now, there's an illustration that I read somewhere, and don't ask me where it's a mess up here. You really like that inside that head is like a mess. But one day I read once a long time ago the story of a Roman general who wanted to conquer all of the world. That's not Alexander. I have Alexander later for you, but not Alexander, some other guy. He wanted to conquer the entire world before he could rest. So he's talking to his lieutenant or someone, and he says, we're going to need to conquer this country. And then when we're done, we'll conquer that country and then that country. And his aide, the lieutenant, asks, why are we doing that? Well, just so we can conquer more. We can conquer more. And then he says, what happens when we've conquered all of the world? And the general says, well, then we'll rest, be merry, and have a banquet. And so the aide looks at him and goes, what prevents us from resting, being merry, and having a banquet now, as opposed to doing all of that and shedding a lot of bloodshed and be miserable for a long time before we actually get to enjoy the banquet? Why not now? He makes a really good point. Why not now? Why do we feel like we have to reach this and then that before we can rest and be content? What is it that when we reach it will actually give us the contentment to allow us to rest if we're not content and rested now? I have things in my mind that I think will make me content if I reach them. I know from personal experience they won't. Been there, done that. What exactly am I after in my restlessness? And what is it that I'm seeking to accomplish that I think I really need in order to get the rest that I think is going to be healthy for me? Another way to look at it is that we are invited today to delight in Christ in the banquet of his presence. There are no worlds for us to conquer before we get there. The war has already been fought and won. So why are we waiting to have that bread with that butter and that chocolate on it? Why are we waiting? So I'm going to list, I'm not much of a list person, but I'm going to list for you a few things that I've experienced and gathered from people much wiser than me, some tips to ward off restlessness when this absence of rest, that thing inside our heart, that thing we can physically feel sometimes, that fretting, that just unrest, this restlessness we feel inside, when it is rooted in discontentment. And maybe that's a way for you to say, yeah, maybe I am discontent and I didn't realize it. Or maybe, nah, she's just talking to the wind. Can't relate to any of that. First things, so I'll give you some do's and some don'ts. When you are feeling restless because of discontent, some suggestions of things to do that I'm preaching to myself here. First, allow yourself to feel your pain. Jackie did that very well. Probably not perfectly, but you invited us into that. Jesus didn't say, don't count as painful what is painful. He never said that. He said, pick up your cross daily. There's a difference there. Rest is not the absence of pain. Jesus acknowledges the crosses. Don't deny them. Acknowledge them. Allow yourself to feel your pain. And then second, talk to God about it. I know it sounds so simple, but we think that if we were the good Christian who's got it all together, we wouldn't really need to talk to God about it, right? Because that sounds like we're complaining, maybe. We're not complaining. And you know what? Talk to your friends about it too. Not everyone. Pick the ones that are safe. I'm sure you have safe friends in this room here. There's a place for sharing your pain that is not murmuring or complaining. Oh, there's a place that is, okay? I'm not talking about that. Chrysostom, who was an early century Christian, said, in a quiet, submissive, still spirit, unbosom your heart to God. And then third, pray for deliverance. Please do, by all means. But deliverance His way, my sisters. When God wills it, as God wills it, and how God wills it. That is how to pray for Him to deliver you from your situation. And then fourth, face your sin square on. Search your heart for discontent. Find it there, confess it, and invite God to uproot it from you. Because confessing it is really going to ease the burden like no other thing. There is no way to root discontent out of your heart except to go to God with it. Because Satan loves to work in the shadows. Don't let that thing grow in the shadows. And five, and by the way, you have a listening guide, and I promise that I'm still sticking to it. There's just a lot of things that kind of got inserted left and right to it. So a lot of things are not in it, but we're still following it. So number 5, know your own heart. You've seen maybe, that image where a man's heart is an on-off button, and a woman's heart is like this complex plane and navigation system thing. I mean, we do have complex hearts. I'm sure guys do too, but I don't know. I'm not one of them. A woman's heart, and a man's probably, is a very complex mechanism. It has many twists and turns, and only God understands it. I do not understand my own heart, which is why I do not trust it. And knowing that I don't know my own heart causes me to know my limits too. Now, a few things not to do. Don't murmur and blame God. That's not necessary. It's not going to help. Don't fret. There's a difference between grieving, which is much more than fine. It's welcome and necessary, and then fretting. Third thing, don't be unraveled by whatever it is you're facing that's causing you discontent. Remember that God is still sitting on His throne. When someone sits, it means that everything has been done. Jesus sits, Jesus sits at the right hand of God. And it's interesting, the only moment in scripture where we see Jesus standing is when he is welcoming Stephen into heaven. He's giving him a standing ovation. But outside of that, Jesus is sitting on his throne. That means he's in control. That means there's nothing to be unraveled about, completely unraveled. And again, Jackie gave us a really good example of that. Whatever it is you're going through is not taking him by surprise. And I know you've heard this before, but I need you to hear it. He is not taken by surprise by whatever it is that wants to unravel you. And that can bring rest to know that. Don't forget your duty is number 4. What I mean by that is, Luther said, ordinary works done in faith and from faith are more precious than heaven and earth combined. Ordinary works done in faith and through faith are more precious than heaven and earth combined. In your restlessness, in your discontent, in your crisis, keep doing the next right thing, because it will keep you tethered. Set your heart to work in your immediate circumstances and take no interest in all of the other options that could be before you. Just stay focused on what he is calling you to do. Number 5, do not allow distractions like fear or shame or guilt. And that's easy to say, not so to do. One of my favorite Puritan, I love to read dead guys, old dead guys who've been dead for centuries. I like the new ones too, but this one. Jeremiah Burroughs, who's an early Puritan, like 1650s, he says, a restful spirit may suffer some ordinary cares and fears to break into the suburbs of the soul, so as to touch lightly upon the thoughts. Yet it will not on any account allow an intrusion into the private room, which is wholly reserved for Jesus Christ as his dwelling place. So yes, allow the restlessness, the discontent, the trials to get to the suburbs of your soul. But the inner temple is for Christ alone. I think that's cool. We could go home with that. Number 6, don't be discouraged. The word courage comes from the French, cœur, which means heart. Do not be disheartened. Do not lose heart, my sister, for what you're going through. A restful spirit learns to delight in God's providence, even when it has no idea how God is going to bring his will to pass. He will give us this day our daily bread.
And now, a brief message from Gospel Spice.
Has Gospel Spice been a blessing to you? If so, would you partner with us to help inspire our generation to delight in God by paying Gospel Spice forward? Our goal is to continue providing in-depth, high-quality, free Bible resources for all. We need your financial support to keep this going. Please pay it forward today by making a tax-deductible donation at gospelspice.com/donate.
Now back to the podcast.
2 Kings 3:17. You will see neither wind nor rain, yet the valley will be filled with water. We don't know where it's coming from, but his goodness is coming. Inner spring of life. Number 7, one of my favorites. Do not try to help God. Self-sufficient girl over here, or former, recovering for sure. Don't seek deliverance at all costs. Accept to sit in the discontent, in the restlessness, until God brings rest. Man-made, self-made rest will not carry you through what you need to go through. Fighting restlessness head-on will only increase it. Again, I'm speaking from personal experience here. Trust his hand and his timing, which means part of the rest is learning to sit still in waiting. because that's how we learn to rest for real. And last, don't envy those who seem to live like you wish you did. There's the story is told of two sisters, a tall sister and a short sister. Well, one was older than the other. The little one was jealous because her older sister had a more beautiful, longer coat. She was jealous because she wanted the long coat too. And so she stole it, took it, put it on, and started walking and tripped over it because it was too long for her. Discontent is when we're trying to put on the coat that is meant for someone else. And we trip over it, and then we're even more discontent. Whereas when you're content with the coat that fits your size, you can just rejoice that you are properly dressed, properly clothed, and that you have everything you need. Restlessness comes from envy, jealousy, comparison. So if you're not restful, not casting any stones, please, takes one to know one. Maybe let's uproot some of the nasty things that prevent rest from growing in our hearts. And next time you look at that sister and you're like, I kind of wish I had the life she has, remember that prosperity, however you want to define that, comes with additional territory, like dangers. Because Satan is attracted to prosperity like moth to a flame. So people who seem to have it all together might, if they really do, be particularly receiving the attacks of Satan. So maybe it's better not to be in their shoes. The taller tree gets the lightning strike. Be careful what you wish for. There's a lot of examples of that in Scripture. The sons of Korah who rebelled because they had a high standing position in the priesthood, but it wasn't good enough. It was really good, just not good enough for them. They got in trouble for that. Speaking of trouble, that's another problem that you get when you attract a particular attention. I used to love pretty shoes. Really high ones. I'm kind of short, so I kind of like a good heel. And in France, we're kind of raised thinking it doesn't matter how much you're in pain as long as the shoe's pretty. I'm a shoeholic and a chocoholic, among other things. But I'm a recovering shoeholic because it's painful. Man. When my daughter was little, I literally had a shoe closet. I mean, that's pathetic. Seriously, shoes. Man, shoes. You thought this was going to be spiritual, right? Anyway, the number of shoes I've had to throw away because I looked at them and I decided the pain was just not worth it. They're pretty, but man, they hurt. So I go for comfy now. So the shoe might be super pretty, but you don't know how much it hurts on the inside. You don't know how much it hurts to be in the position of whoever it is you're envying. And if you knew, maybe you wouldn't envy them so much, and maybe you would actually start praying for them instead. Because that will cause rest in your heart. And then that person that you're envying, well, remember that to whom much is given. Yep. Are you really sure you want that to be required of you too? Because the last thing is God will ask for accounts. And again, to whom much is given. So before God, how did we manage our resources? That's the parable of the 10 talents. I won't go into it, but some days I'm just really happy I don't have 10. There's an old saying in French that says that a full heart makes no noise, as opposed to an empty heart that is going to cling like cymbals. What it means by that, and you can try that at home, an empty glass of crystal, if you bang it, it's going to make a lot of noise. If it's full, it will hardly make a sound. If your heart is full of God, you will not make a sound and complain. If your heart is empty, when you complain, it's going to make a lot of sound. The water of His presence is the inner spring that fills our hearts so that they are full of Him, even when we feel restless. I'm not judging here. I'm not condemning. I'm just saying I'm trying to give you hope here. Contentment, just like rest, is a matter of the soul. So yes, there's physical rest. But some people can be very well rested physically and mentally, spiritually, utterly empty. The opposite is rare. You cannot shape a vase by the water you're going to put into it. Think about that. The water will be shaped by the vase. If your heart has the shape of discontent, it does not matter what you put into it, it will look like discontent. So allow the potter to transform your vase into the shape he would give it. Your heart and your mind, Romans 12:2, be transformed by the renewing of your mind. That's the new shape of the vase that God gives you. So that your mind is shaped like the vase that he would want, and your heart, so that you will test and see his good and perfect will. That's rest for our soul. And then those afflictions that would have caused you restlessness before, you are surprised to find that instead you receive from them this inner shape of contentment, and you actually experience rest for your soul in a situation that would have caused you discontent before. That is worth a serious celebration when that happens. Bring out the chocolate queen on the bread. Now, rest is not the absence of affliction. Look at Jesus. I can stop there. You can have near perfect life circumstances and still experience restlessness. And that's where Alexander the Great complained when he had no more worlds to conquer. That's a heart of discontent right there. In the same way, you can experience rest inside your affliction and trials. The Puritans called that, I quote, the art and mystery of contentment. I'm going to read to you a sentence. The world is infinitely deceived in thinking that contentment and rest lie in having more than we already have. What generation do you think said that? The world is infinitely deceived in thinking that contentment and rest lie in having more than we already have. Sounds like we could have said that today. This was written in 1648. It's not new. So, we were reading from Matthew 8, heads of grain, Sabbath, disciples eating through the fields, Pharisee not happy, tabernacle connection. David's men ate from the tabernacle of the bread of the presence, right? It's not about the rule, it's about the spirit of the law. True rest is not the absence of activity, but the presence of God. True rest is not the absence of activity, but the presence of God. So we looked at the foods not to enjoy. So what is it we're supposed to enjoy? What are those heads of grain we can enjoy? Who is our bread? In a nutshell, the bread of the presence, Jesus is our nourishment. He fills the source. So he's the bread and he's the water. Let me take you to French for just a minute. I loved how several times today or yesterday you talked about deliciousness. I want to talk about the delight of spiritual nourishment from a French perspective. That word delight, I told you how the English has about twice as many words. This is another case, where the French brings an interesting connection. If it didn't, I wouldn't talk to you about it, right? There's a lot of places where it doesn't. I'm not going to mention them. But delight, that word delight is one of my favorite words in English. And it's also one of my favorite words in French, because in French, it just exudes a depth and a deliciousness that is just not there in English. Because in French, the word delight is the word délice. Delicious is also délice. It's the same word in French. Delightful and delicious is the same word in French, which tells you that God in French is both delightful and delicious. That goes deeper than it might take a second to ponder. God in French is delicious. That means that any way we want to delight in God, This is about a feast of the body, the mind, and the spirit, where beauty and delight and deliciousness reign supreme. Jesus uses so many good food illustrations. I think he might have been French. Last night, we looked at rest as dwelling in the presence of God, and we're going to add the dimension of delight. Delighting in God means many things. It's at least going to mean that I'm going to take my eyes off of myself. Just that, that's restful, right? The Sabbath, the way the disciples were experiencing it that day in those fields of grains, it's not legalistic, but it's about the relationship and the intimacy. It's that deep knowing where the dwelling, the delighting, and the resting come together. In Hebrews 4, I think your notes say 1 to 11, but it's actually kind of the whole chapter. I'm not going to read it, but what happens is that they're being brought back into what happened in the Old Testament. In the Old Testament, the promised land became reality for the Israelites through Joshua, but that was not true rest, contends the writer to Hebrews. Joshua points to a greater, deeper rest that is not physical, but is spiritual. And the Pharisees who accused Jesus of eating bread in the fields, they're the ones who actually didn't enter rest, even though they were accusing Jesus and his disciples of doing that. And I'm guilty of that. Where is it that I'm forcing false rest on myself and on others? Where am I prioritizing doing over being with God and others? Where am I losing relationship over that? Where am I choosing sacrifice over mercy? Jesus told them it is better to show mercy than to have sacrifices. Where am I focused on self, like the Pharisees and their fearful pride? The Pharisees were not very content and rested people for all of their commandments. Here's the thing that struck me. I was literally this morning reading Deuteronomy 2nd, and in it, God is telling Moses, I don't want you to go through, you're going to go through the land of the Edomites, but you are not going to stop there. Like, you're literally not even like a footprint of your feet is going to belong to you there. You're just passing through. You're going to have to pay for water and for bread as you go through, because it's not your land to go. You just go through it. But sometimes we don't do that. And God is telling them, you won't find rest in the land of the Edomites because that's not your promised land. Rest cannot be found in the wrong promised land. That is why the Israelites did not really find rest in the Old Testament promised land, because they needed spiritual rest, not just physical rest. So in what areas of our lives have we settled for the wrong promised lands? One of the key sentences I want us to focus on tonight is the concept of practicing for heaven. We are on earth to practice for heaven, but we cannot practice for heaven if we have settled in the wrong promised land. So first, we need to be in the right place. C.S. Lewis, one of my favorite authors, finishes the Chronicles of Narnia, and they're basically entering heaven. And at the end, he says, now at last they were beginning chapter 1 of the great story no one on earth has ever read, which goes on forever and in which every chapter is better than the one before. It can start today. I told you last night, heaven doesn't start the day you die. You started eternal life the day you accepted Christ. That means every chapter of your life can be better. Did not say easier. Better than the one before. The true promised land flowing with milk and honey, which Joshua's conquest didn't give them, it was a shadow of the true promised land, who is Christ.
There's so much more to share about this, but our time is up for today, so just stay tuned for the next episode where we will conclude our series on rest with the second half of this talk.
Hi, Jonah here. We are so glad you joined us today. If you've enjoyed this episode, please give us a star rating and a comment on your podcast listening app. Consider also talking to your church leader about welcoming Stephanie to your church. She's currently taking speaking engagements for the next 18 months. Finally, know we are praying for you. You can confidentially email us your prayer requests and praise items at the email address contact@gospelspice.com. We look forward to serving you again with our next episode. Merci.